running is such like an accessible sport, and how I think that even though it's so accessible and you do have like this resurgence of a running boom because of, when COVID started happening, I do think it's interesting that there's still this like pretty big divide between like the elites and then sort of the every runner.
Welcome to episode 1 of Running the Show, where we explore the intersection of running and business. Today is a getting to know us style episode with hosts Emma Kertesz, Drew Hartman, and Evan Schwartz. We discuss what interests us most and what we want to explore in this podcast, our personal relationship with the sport, and things we'd like to see potentially change in the running industry as well. Thanks for joining us, and let's dive into episode 1 of Running the Show.
Well, for many folks who are interested in the scope of what we want to talk about in this podcast, they may be wondering, who are the people behind it and why are we having this conversation, and what are our credentials and where do our interests lie, and how that relates to our own passion for sport and business. So this episode just kind of wants to toe the line of anticipation towards things we're going to discuss, but also kind of ground our discussion. Why are we here in the first place? Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
So like why are we here is a cosmic sort of question? Or like why are we physically here in your apartment recording this show?
That's true.
For the first time. We've never recorded this before.
No, we've never recorded this before.
Yeah, this is definitely, we're going to do our best to roll with the punches, ignore the dog rolling around in the back with a toy, and, talk it out.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. Emma, why are you here?
Well, you two asked me to be here, and I said yes. But really, I am interested in like the salary transparency of running. That in terms of like the business side, that really interests me, because in all other major sports, you have this like salary transparency where there's these huge press conferences that go on, and they're like announcing how much so-and-so signed for, and you don't have that in track and field. And I think that's really interesting as we're trying to make track and field go into like a bigger space and become a bigger sport and make it a major player on like the national and international scene. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that I've always really been interested in. And so that's one of the main reasons why I'm here. So where are you here, Evan?
I am here because I'm also interested in what you said. I'm sure I'll be interested in what Drew has to say as well. But the main thing that I'm interested in is all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So by now we've decided on a cool name like Running the Show. And I'm more interested in the people running the things, not physically running, but putting on events, putting on different cool experiences. And so I feel like that's the main draw for me. Running, whatever, the physical act, who cares about that anymore? There's so many cool layers to it. But I feel like I've gone through different phases of my own like personal work career, like putting on races and then like doing a few races of my own too. So it's very interesting to see that side to me. And I feel like it doesn't get represented as much. So that's the reason that I'm here. Drew, what about you?
Yeah, I definitely resonate with the athlete side of things. Like you mentioned, Emma, to start, to think about the effort it takes to kind of cross the finish line, to even ink that deal, whatever it may be. And then the disclosure thereafter, I think is super interesting. And on the production side as well, right? When we think about, going to Eugene for track trials, there are so many elements that needed to happen in order for that event to even take place, mm-hmm. right? And everybody has an opinion about how that went, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's the other side of that exact thing you mentioned. I'm also interested in kind of brand stories and brand interactions with the sport, since there isn't the presence of like a single unifying body like the NFL or the NHL or MLB to drive the sport forward. It's mainly been through brand actors, and then let's say like more content creators outside of that as well. So it's kind of the intersection of those bodies that are making the sport more visible. And I think that's an interesting part for me as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
super interesting. I have one, like, I guess just begging the question of, does track actually need a big governing body like that to push it forward? Like you mentioned, NFL,
Ooh.
NHL, MLB. One could argue the NCAA is also like that, but not necessarily for track. Does that even need to happen?
That's a great question. I think this is the tricky part about like wanting to host a podcast and then somebody actually asks you the question and you're like, oh, no, I'm just here to ask them.
We're just here to ask the questions,
Yeah, I'm here to
not
ask
answer
the questions,
them.
not answer them. So it's interesting to think about that, right? Because you can see a pure example of it in front of us, right? With MLB, and probably one that we've heard more often is like F1, right? F1, people have been talking about making a Drive to Survive Netflix style series for track and field that would mimic that. And even in golf, there's been like the LIV, like Live League that's come about, and that was right, to spin off a PGA that's paying out aggressively compared to regular tournament structure. So I think it's easy to see that kind of dangled carrot when we look at other leagues and say, oh, well, us too, right? That would be a rising tide raises all ships. But I think it's more difficult than the presence of a league in itself, because the Diamond League does exist already. It hasn't picked up traction in the way that we would hope or expect. And to me, that tells me that we're looking at more deeper issues, probably around sponsorship, probably around visibility. So I think the presence of a league alone, no.
Would the Diamond League be cooler if it was called the Zurich Golden League and they actually gave people that won events a big bar of gold at the end?
That would be cool.
I mean, that would be sick.
Yeah.
That
Was
happened.
that under discussion?
No, that happened already, and it folded in favor of the Diamond League. So
was that because they went?
Really?
Did they go bankrupt or
I
like?
have no idea.
Okay,
Yeah. That's something we can follow up.
I'm picturing
it would be cool.
the presence of. I'm picturing like from the inflation side of things, or just generally from a material good standpoint. Like at first it was like a bar of gold, and then eventually they're just like, I don't know, here's like a wheelbarrow of gold dust.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is like the best we could do right now on this schedule.
Yes. Yeah. And then it started getting traded in cryptocurrency. It turned into a whole mess. And they couldn't physically lift the stuff above their head. The whole blockchain,
Yeah.
I feel like, that's enough like plotting around the other question stuff too. Going on to the next thing we want to introduce, because this is our introduction episode. Our relationship to running not only gives insight into our personal experiences and kind of maybe why we're experts, but also kind of shines light on like some of our experiences. So Emma, I would love to hear from you what your relationship to running is, because Drew and I both know to a decent degree, but I feel like we learn all the time when we actually sit down and talk about it instead of just being on a group run or something like that.
Yeah. Well, my relationship is definitely evolving. I ran at the University of Toledo, was an
Go Rockets!
Go Rockets! I was an All-American in the 10,000. Felt like I was good enough to try to train post-collegiately and try and hit a qualifier for the marathon trials for the OTQ. And did that, and then did it again. And so now qualified twice for the Olympic trials and the marathon, and have been running post-collegiately really since I graduated. And it's really been like in the last couple years that my relationship with running has evolved, where I used to really prioritize my life around my running life and what like job I had and what I was doing outside of practice and how much I was sleeping and who I hung out with. And now I feel like I'm evolving that I'm trying to make running like a piece of my life and have it fit into what I'm doing, because I'm getting older in terms of running career. I'm getting older. And
but you're not getting older in like real life.
And not in real life, just in running. Yeah, just in running. And so now I want to like challenge myself to do something new and to do different things outside of just like getting the OTQ, because I found myself in this kind of weird rut where it's like you do the fall marathon and then you work on speed work in the spring and then you put in a big summer and then you race the fall marathon and then you do the speed work in the spring and so on and so forth. And so like this upcoming year, I'm trying to break that cycle and really focus on the process and having fun with it. And hopefully with that will come a third OTQ, But yeah, the last couple of years has definitely evolved for me. And there was a while there where I kind of lost like the reasoning why I was even running. Like I was just like, oh, I think I'm just good at this. And, and that might be enough for some people, but I was like, I'm not sure that's enough to get me out the door every day anymore. And so I really had to evaluate, like, why am I actually doing this? Like, do I enjoy this? What am I trying to gain from this? Like, what does this add to my life? And so I feel like I'm kind of on the tail end of that and now finding like a much better relationship with running.
Yeah. I have a quick follow-up question. What is an OTQ? Can you give us maybe a glossary of different abbreviations and acronyms?
Yes. So an OTQ is an Olympic Trials qualifier. So every 4 years, there is an Olympic Trials for the marathon for the Olympics. And so USATF sets, USATF, United States
of America.
Track and field, and then association. I just had a moment where I was like, oh my God, what does USATF stand for? Anyway.
What do they stand for? That's the next episode.
Well, yeah. I was going to say, when we were talking about leagues and governing bodies, I was like, oh, do you really want to hear my thoughts on USATF?
There's a reason why I didn't bring them up for a reason.
Yeah. But USATF will set the standards every 4 years, and they open the window to qualify. And it's usually like a 2.5-year window. And then once you hit those marks, you punch your ticket to the Olympic trials. And there they select the top 3 or whoever comes in 1, 2, 3. That's our Olympic team, as long as they have the Olympic standard, which we can talk in depth about.
I know, yeah.
That's a whole other can of worms as to what that looks like and what happens if someone doesn't have the standard and ends up coming in that top 3 position. But yeah, so that's a little bit of a glossary definition of a few of the acronyms.
So people listening right now have at least 3 episodes promised for us diving into all of those.
Absolutely, yes.
Or like some pre-recorded like Patreon content.
That's true.
Yes,
that is
yes, for sure.
It is very, very true.
I swear I know what USA stands for. I just had a moment where I was like, oh my God, what does USATF stand for?
Well, it's like when you're singing the Star Spangled Banner, and like that's when people forget it, right? When the camera's on them.
Yeah. When
they finally have the microphone in their hand. So
yeah,
it's understandable.
Yeah.
We're hands-free microphone.
That's true.
That's true.
And when I think of you two in a similar breath in going after the OTQ, right? That is a commonality of your journeys, but obviously we're all in Boulder now, so that's another common denominator. But Evan, how would you add to the tapestry of your relationship?
Interesting. I like being on a tapestry. Yeah. It's kind of fun. I've never been on a tapestry before. And then if people aren't watching the associated video content, my name is Evan. I'm sitting, is this stage right or is this stage left? I think this is stage left.
You're stage left.
Yeah, I'm stage left. Then Drew's stage right, Emma's in the middle, star of the show. Stage middle, exactly. I think it's an interesting question because a year ago I would have had a completely different answer. Maybe even like a week or 2 ago, I'd had a different answer. Maybe a year from now, I'll have a different answer. My relationship with running started like in elementary school, middle school. I remember watching the different like track meets on TV. And Hickam El Garouge was running and like was destroying everybody. And I was like, wow, that person's like fast, but kind of like a superstar. And my dad was really, really into running. He ran in college, ran the Boston Marathon. He actually ran in college with Drew Hunter's dad at Cleveland State.
Really?
So little fun fact there. Go Vikings. But like running was always seen as a thing. Like when I played soccer growing up, it was like I like running after the ball. But then eventually it turned into forgetting the soccer ball, forgetting the shin guards and stuff, and turning just into running in like middle school, high school. Ran in college for a couple of years. Got cut from the Ohio State University cross country team, started training for the marathon. And then 3 years after I started training for the marathon, I qualified for the Olympic trials in 2017, got the OTQ, as listeners will remember, stands for Olympic Trials Qualifier. Ran the 2020 trials in Atlanta, dropped out at 21, worst race of my life, except I remember Emma and I waving across the road to each other when we would pass each other. So it was very fun. It wasn't necessarily for performance for me at that point. And then I'd been in Boulder for a couple of years, and I feel like my relationship with running evolved. As soon as I got to Boulder, I had preconceived notions that I would suddenly be a 2:12 marathoner, just because I was living in altitude and things would just click. It didn't happen. And then over the past couple of years, I've gotten more into coaching, gotten more into supporting other people's running via pacing. I've gotten a lot more into cycling because that's what you do in Boulder. You get that punch card there too. But I feel like my relationship has gone more towards the business side, more towards the coaching side. I've been in the running industry for like 8 or 10 years now, somewhere between that, depending on if you call college part-time work at the running store, actually being in the running industry, or if it's just
I would say
part-time
yes.
job
Yeah.
to get discounts on shoes and stuff. So 10 years in the running industry, but it has evolved, I feel like, very rapidly over the past year or two to being less about my personal running, which actually means running takes up a lot more time than it used to, because it's all about other people's running and the business side of it too, including some of my favorite brands like Tracksmith. And I don't know if we have any resident experts here necessarily that have insight over that, but I think it is very interesting because, Drew, as you likened, Emma and I have a similarity when it comes to maybe pursuing elite side of the sport, but then you and I have both been like plugged into the like running market, running as a business, running as the livelihood, running as the thing that kind of makes our hair get pulled out because we're talking about the industry and stuff like that. So can you share us maybe your relationship with running?
Yeah. So my relationship with running started a little bit later in life. I did run track in high school. It was a way of staying in shape for soccer, so that was a commonality.
Classic.
Classic kid. I don't know if I had like an easy departure from soccer, where I wanted to keep playing for a while. I wanted to play in college and just didn't work out. I was not the size or the skill needed to play at the level I wanted to play.
Because you're 6'8".
Yeah. They said you're too big for the sport. Do you want to try rowing? And I was like, oh no. No, I am every bit of like 5'7", and there's not much going on other than that, right? So my departure from soccer was, I was running to stay in shape, and it was an accessory to what I was doing, and found that was something I enjoyed when I did it. So kind of doubled down a bit, had like a bucket list relationship with marathons starting out. And I thought it would be great to run a marathon on my 21st birthday. And I did. And then I found a marathon on my 22nd birthday and ran that. And then I was like, oh, this is going to get really difficult from a scheduling perspective to keep doing this. So I still enjoy running marathons, but my relationship with running has changed, because I do treat it, I think, in the same way that I used to treat soccer. I think running at first was kind of like a fun activity that I would do for a period of time. Then I would drop off the map, and I had the experience, the event, full stop. And now I see it as more of like a labor of love and something to develop and grow over time. So that's kind of like on the running side. But from the business side of things, I do work in the running industry. I work in marketing for Tracksmith, and been really fortunate to start my career in the running industry with them back in 2017. So it's been a long time. It started off in retail, then moved to customer experience and doing like pop-up activations. And now on the marketing side, managing things are a little bit more on like go-to-market strategy, influencer relationships, getting my hands into copy a bit, and execution of like brand vision. So it's been a collision course, truly, at that time, and I was super grateful for it. But prior to that, I think my obsession with business and sport combined started when I was in law school. After undergrad, I went to law school, and I really thought it'd be fun to do like intellectual property work. And I don't come from a science background, a hard science background. So patents were out of my comfort zone because they're so invested in tech, and my value to somebody seeking a patent is really small without that specialization, without an engineering degree, without a chemical engineering degree or chemistry, right? I would offer little. So trademarks and copyrights were things that were interesting to me, and I thought the intersection of sport was super cool. Like the trademark protections on like the Nike swoosh and the story about that, and even the lawsuits that take place between like Walmart and Skechers to figure out who did it first, right? In terms of design, like those are things that always popped up to me as interesting. And while I was in law school and for a little bit after, I worked with a venture accelerator. So was working as their legal information officer. I wasn't allowed to call myself an attorney because I have not passed the bar. I will fully say that I'm not a practicing attorney in any way, shape, or form. So anything that I say that is like, I should do this, right? And I'm going to look directly at the camera when I do this. Which one's on me? This one. Anything that I say in the legal sense or any speculation that I have is purely legal information. It is not legal advice. And you should not take it. You should consult an attorney for this. So that is probably the one thing I can say I tapped in with from my time in law school is to know to say that to people.
Yeah. That was the worst ad read I've ever heard.
I know, right? Yeah, that's the worst ad read for Northeastern University Law School you've ever heard in your life. Go Huskies. But that when I was there, I worked I did an internship at the UFC and like did contract work for fighters and on the employer side as well, and with vendors and sponsors. And I just thought it was so interesting how there is such a symbiotic relationship between athlete and governing bodies and sponsors and how it all works. So I think that was a real deepening of that relationship. And now that I'm in the running industry, it's always been an interest in that regard, but now the focus is kind of shifted away from combat sports and in that realm and towards like the industry I'm in now, which is running, and in most cases through the lens of Tracksmith and how I view things as a marketer. It was a very long way to get there, but here we go.
Yeah,
I love that. Another like kind of angle that I'm interested in hearing about, obviously we mentioned we already have a couple of other topics of shows that we can talk about, but we would love to hear from other experts in the industry too. So I would pose first to Emma, who's a dream guest you would want to have on the show?
Well, I think in terms of athletes, I'd love to have Sage Hurta and Dakota Lindworm on the show because I feel like both of them have had such like amazing trajectories through their careers. And I just would love to pick their brains. I think that they're both really great like advocates for the sport. And I just want to hear about their trajectory and like how they got there and the building blocks to, Sage breaking 2 in the 800 and then doing it like 5 different times like this summer, and Dakota being like one of, America's most consistent female marathoners. And so I think that would be super interesting. I'd also like to have Matt Taylor on, the founder and CEO of Tracksmith. I think that'd be super interesting and hear about how he got his start in the industry because he's also a really great guy. It's not a plug, but I think it'd be really interesting to have him on and pick his brain a little bit as well.
That was a much better ad read too.
Thank you. Thank you.
I agree with where these like founder stories and origin stories for brands are something we don't hear as often because at least in this industry as I feel, because like the industry is dominated by so few, right? Like we have like the big players in the space, and there's a copy of Shoe Dog right off camera, right? Like we have that account of things, and we've seen documentaries on the other big brands, but there are players in the space that don't necessarily get to tell their story, or a majority of people don't know like how things started and how the message of and the mission of that company like is pervasive through like the day to day. But I remember when you said before that you wanted to do an episode with like Dakota or Sage, and from the athlete side of things, like I'm also curious for Sage, for example, right, moving to a new discipline in the scope of like a team and how that dictates like the relationship to the team and the relationship to the brand, if that is a
Right.
conversation that has to happen, or was that a sage decision? Was it influenced by the team? Right. These are all things that we don't get to see or know much about. And
Right.
I think it'd be really cool to hear somebody speak about that in depth, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hmm.
Who would your dream guest be,
Ooh.
Evan?
Yeah, I think we are all similar that the founder stuff is interesting, even though like the athlete side, I feel like right now the way it is done is, and we've talked about this off camera, and I feel like this gets talked about at group runs too, but like athlete has breakout performance or athlete has really good race. They go on a couple different podcasts and they talk about the same thing, how they got started running in high school and they were a phenom and they won Foot Locker. Then how maybe they went to one of the top 5, Power 5 conference schools and won an NCAA title. And then they happened to get a pro contract and then they had a really good race or
It's
something.
so boilerplate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which it's cool to hear about.
Not to take away from anyone's
Not
experience,
to take
but
away.
Yeah.
yes, it is one side that we hear often.
Yes.
To your point.
Yes. So I would like to also put out there that we want to try and fill the gaps and look at maybe things that are slightly different than the normal podcasts that you might find looking through the top 10 running podcast shows too. The founder stuff really interests me. I think being able to, like Drew just mentioned Shoe Dog, I've read that book like 2 or 3 times and I've listened to it on audiobook 2 or 3 times, just recognizing it is maybe a slightly biased account because it's an autobiography, but there are really cool stories that you would have no idea existed. But there are so many stories like that happening for different running clubs, happening for different running shoe stores, and happening for different athletes that are creating their own brands, because athletes are brands now. Athletes have their own logos. Being able to hear founder stuff, not just from big monopoly brands, I think would be super cool. I would love to hear from Sebco and have some answers that or ask questions that have different answers than we usually hear, not just about how cool it is to have a track meet in Eugene, Oregon again, like Drew kind of alluded to with US champs being there. But to hear from somebody who's like super important in the sport from a performance side way back when, years and years and years ago, has won Olympic medals, but then is in a very big leadership position now too. So I feel like that would be very, very cool to have somebody like Sebco on the show as well and talk all about that side of it too.
You'd have to ask him more about the cross country making it into Winter Olympics, right?
Yes.
Everybody wants cross country in the Winter Olympics. As long as you run through a windmill or like a hallway with carpet on it, and like European style stuff too.
I did see the recent photos that came out of the Justin Britain token. A bunch of people were there, but he shared this photo, and one of the Atalanta team members, Effie, mentioned it was the first time she ran through a museum in a race. So I guess that was how they directed people through it, right? On a carpet through a museum.
Yeah.
Super cool.
I saw the pictures. It looked awesome.
What do you think that Strava segment is called? Is it like something creative, or
it's called Blue Wing or something?
Blue Wing,
right?
yeah.
The Blue Wing of the museum or something.
Drew, I'm going to flip it on you because you have a different aspect, being maybe plugged in a little bit more to some of the people that like talk about podcasts. You obviously, are very plugged into like the actual. I wouldn't necessarily call it running apparel monopoly yet, but people definitely recognize the place that you work at too. So, from your perspective, who would be like a dream guest or two?
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased as well. Like I personally, I work at the company I work at because I resonate with the founder story associated with it, right? Knowing, how Matt started in the sport and how it developed into what he built, and how to this day, right? The company started in 2013 technically, and we're in 2022 right now, going to 2023, and knowing that vision has been like a flag post throughout the development of the company, I think is super interesting. So to this conversation about like origin stories, to me, it doesn't matter when the origin story conversation that we have with people, like where it lines up in the company timeline, right? Because I think for many brands out there, they've started on such like a foundation of belief and passion that I really can't wait to hear what, let's say, like what Stride, what Lever, what Nike has to say at this point in the development of their company, right? Because it started from a kernel and it's developed beyond probably the bounds and vision that they anticipated, but it still started from an origin. So yeah, I would love to pull, Matt Taylor in as well to get that origin story. But on the brand side, you're right. I'm interested in that world. And I think a way to make it even more interesting is pulling individuals from those companies to speak about like roles within those brands. Because I think when we look at brands as kind of like a monolith of what they produce, or at least I think I'm making that assumption, right? That people see like the work product, they see the advertising and they see the product and it's kind of like, well, that's what they are, right? But I think there are some interesting things we could talk about from, let's say, somebody I'm interested in maybe talking to is like somebody who does color design for Nike, because that is a position, right? Somebody is in charge of of dictating the colors that are going to be expressed in spring 2023 and how they are, imposed upon the silhouettes of that particular sport, right? Somebody does that. And there's somebody with like a vision board that kind of pulls all those things together. Like that's a position that people might not have heard of before and would probably be interested to see like, how are you influenced in your day to day? Like what's your, what's moving the needle for you in the day to day, right? So I think that's super interesting. I think designers and unpacking their thought process is super cool. But I would say that I'm also biased in saying that a lot of my conversations in the sport relate to the content creators in it, and then also to the clubs and crew scene as well. And I see that that is such a cool microcosm of running.
Oh yeah.
Where there's a perspective of like, there's the people getting into running for the first time, right? Maybe coming from a different sport, maybe coming into movement altogether for the first time. There's people who are at the top end of the sport, but I do think it's interesting to find how crews and clubs fill this void between those two spaces. There's definitely overlap in all of it, and there's definitely huge striations within those clubs and crews, but to see those entities as their own like engine for bringing people to the sport is the reason why brands get involved with them. And I think that's such a cool way to unpack that. Specifically, I think about there like some friends in Los Angeles that have been very strategic in who they partner with and who they don't partner with, or if they have a partner at all, because it could either jeopardize like the livelihood of this club. It could maybe change the perception outwardly or internally for how those clubs have functioned. There's just so much to explore that I think a lot of people would be interested in, but just don't necessarily have those conversations to start. So, yeah, I would say that on another tangent, I was bringing up this idea as well, that from this brand side or like this pitching side, venture side of things, there's so many people with ideas and how to innovate within what we enjoy, right? Within the activity of running and within the sport of running, which is two different things, and that's a whole other episode. Truly.
It's at least four.
Well, at least four now.
It's at least 4 episodes, right? Like the activity versus the sport of running is like such an interesting thing to talk about. But in the grand scheme of things, there's a lot of people who want to do something new and to disrupt it. And I think there's a way for us to create a platform and to have people talk about those ideas. And I think big pie in the sky, it'd be super cool if we were to partner with a brand, an organization, or like a venture capital firm to give a platform for people to express these ideas and receive funding for their vision. So there are people who do it, again, biased audience, like there's the Tracksmith Fellowship program that does fund creator projects. And I think if we provided a similar platform that was maybe more publicly facing in terms of the expression and maybe the debate about the merits of projects, I think would be really cool for people to get involved with that.
The layers that I see more now, we talk about, between us three, that we want to target the intersection between business and running. But then what you just said kind of made me realize that running itself isn't just running, and business isn't just a business, and the intersection isn't just one intersection between the two different things. So I feel like maybe we need to rewrite some copy of we're looking at a bunch of different intersections coming up to a bunch of different intersections too. And I think that's interesting. The other thing that I got reminded of very vividly when you were describing maybe the things we don't consider, like talking about the run crews that people outside of LA might not know what you were talking about, of like, oh yeah, LA-based run crews are like the big clubs in New York City, Chicago, all around. But Emma and I, and then my girlfriend Rachel, we were biking on the California International Marathon course. Started around like 5:30 in the morning to go out on the course, but at like 6 a.m. in the dark, there were masses of people setting up the tables for water. And that is just something I feel like I recognized in that moment, and being reminded now, when you're running a marathon, there are like the cups of water and the people don't just magically appear as you are approaching it.
Yeah.
Like those are things that are very real and tangible and you can see, but require so much planning, so many logistics to get done. And it's not just, people like holding out a garden hose, like filling up stuff, but like that is just one thing on one race day. But that and so much more happens like behind the scenes that nobody really talks about or even like thinks about too. So I feel like filling that void, being able to talk about all those things, but look at all those different intersections is a very interesting subject. And we might not be able to come up with all our like dream guests right now, but those subjects I feel like open the door towards like having a massive guest list that's maybe more than just 4 episodes too. Down maybe like 6 seasons in a movie or something like that too.
Nice reference.
We'll see what happens.
I can definitely tell you though that one of the water stations at CIM did taste like a garden hose. So
that was the sponsored by the garden hose. Like in the first 5
the Garden Hose Coalition.
Yes,
they all got together. So.
Actually sponsored by On, because I don't know if you guys knew this, but they were Swedish engineered and or Swiss engineering and designed to look like garden hose. That was the
started off with that way.
It was a whole
It's a whole thing.
It's a whole thing.
It's a whole thing. How do we want to leave this off? And do you guys have any other closing thoughts before we wrap up this first intro episode that we have?
Well, something I want to make sure that we put a pin in and revisit if we don't speak to it right now is a question that we want to ask guests, right? To leave off with everybody, to leave off on the question, like, what is something you would change about the industry tomorrow? And this is to use the phrase again, like big pie in the sky, right? This is not limited by money. It's not limited by feasibility, but that would be a pin I want to put in. But are there any other things that we want to get to prior to that?
I don't have anything, but what you just brought up sounds like something that definitely should have been on the docket, and I should have remembered as a question before we left too. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Because that sounds great for the first time we're recording this.
I definitely, we'll get to this, but I definitely want to talk about, because I remember, even though this is the first time we're recording this,
for sure.
But when I was thinking about that answer, I remember thinking about how, running is such like an accessible sport, and how I think that even though it's so accessible and you do have like this resurgence of a running boom because of, when COVID started happening, I do think it's interesting that there's still this like pretty big divide between like the elites and then sort of the every runner. Like I had brought up a point before, like off air, that, people don't get to play on the same basketball court as LeBron James, but the every average runner gets to run the Boston Marathon, the same course that Des Linden does. And so, I want to talk about like, how do we bridge that gap between like the elites and then like the every runner that's out there, and like, what does that look like and how can that happen? And, I'm just like really interested in that.
Yeah. To flip that back to you, right? When like the basketball example, right? We're not playing on the same court as LeBron James, but we might be wearing his jersey, right? Like that. I think that highlights the that dichotomy that you're talking about.
Mhm.
And, when you think of that example, is the issue with running, is it like the lack of star quality, or is it the lack of platform? Like, if you were to address that today, how would you approach it?
Well, I think like it starts with, like the jersey thing, like the fandom, right? I mean, because I do think there's like a fervor around like certain athletes in running and everything. And I think that's great. But then also like to grow the sport more, that would create more of that fandom. And so, which I think can be solved by, serving alcohol at track meets.
Oh, let's go.
Sports betting.
Whoa.
Having like more of a, like, I know like there's an American Track League, but like having more of like a bigger presence of that and like really growing the fan base of the sport and like really lifting that up. Because I think that would be, that would add to like the star power, right? Because like I think a lot of people recognize Des Linden's name, like, or Meb, really. Like, he goes by one name, Meb.
That's true.
And so I think there is some star power there, but I think that there's some things that the governing body could do to help with that like star power and like make that a little bit more of like a fandom.
Yeah, well, we should tailgate track meets, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that'd be awesome.
I've been doing that for years, and they just tell me to get out of the parking lot.
I have so many clarifying questions that I would love to engage with you a little bit more on this. So to put a pin in that and to return to that. I have a fair amount of clarifying questions.
Yeah.
5
I'm
episodes.
excited. Yeah.
If this is my pie in the sky
idea
I love
that.
Of how to help the sport, So.
Totally. Should we visit the question that we feel like we're going to ask people to, like, for whenever we do have at least 5 more guests come on? What would you change about the sport? Do we want to round out the show?
Emma kicked us off. I want to see like what I know our interests overlap, but does our passion for change also overlap? And where does it deviate for you?
The passion, I think, overlaps, but I feel almost I don't necessarily feel like individual in my, because this question is pie in the sky.
Right.
What would you change? And I feel like there are a bunch of things I would change, but the top number one thing, first time I'm saying this while we're recording it, is just much better doping control. And I feel like from my perspective, having raced on, I did the USATF road circuit for a couple of years. I was never drug tested because there's not supply to test people finishing outside the top 10 necessarily. But even today, there was like a really big announcement from USADA about a college runner, 400 meter guy that he has now like a 4-year ban for tampering with samples. And he was a Bowerman finalist.
Wow.
So just like today. So not necessarily just for actual drug tests, but doping control as a whole, being able to provide a much more massive budget just to make that just not a question. So instead of having drug testers, when they come to Boulder, only drive as far north as South Boulder and test the closest runner there so they can just hop back on the plane and go to the airport, being able to have maybe somebody stationed in these hotbeds. There are publicly available stats of the number of times people specifically are tested by USADA, and that is like free information you can look up that is updated weekly. And the number of people that have qualified for like world championship teams and Olympic teams that have been tested in the very low single digits per quarter or per year is frankly like appalling to me from just like an oversight thing. So the one thing I would change is like blank check for doping control. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole system changes immediately, but it means that one of maybe the barriers of entry for being able to get, more believable performances, more like integrity into the sport as a whole before you try and bridge the gaps and before you try and like pump up fandom and stuff, like making sure that's secure. That's like the one thing that I would change, just to be like, oh yeah, that'd be like good and written off and just taken care of too. So that's my pie in the sky, and it's like pecan flavored, I think.
And with that, so you're saying there should be a Flagstaff officer, a Boulder officer, a Big Bear officer, maybe somebody who's in
Mammoth and a couple towns in Utah,
right?
Yeah, just
or in Eldoret, right? Like you know,
Yeah.
Now this is kind of a question to mull over in the grand scheme of that as well. Is I think in the combat sport space, people have been talking about doping control for a long time because it started from a place where it didn't exist, and there's been more attention and regulation more recently in that side of the world, and that side of in that sport. There have been conversations in that space of what would it look like to have a league or a division that is not regulated, and then a league that is, right? It's similar to almost like there's like the bodybuilding side of things, right? Where there's like a natural division, and then there's a
open
bodybuilding division, you know?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like a bodybuilding division, right? And do you think that there's, maybe a space and place for that? Or at this stage in the sport, are we not ready for that?
Well, that's how it goes normally right now too. So like the open division is the open division and it's the natural division at the same time.
Sure.
We're talking about running performances because
and semantics.
Yes, the number of people that test positive and get popped for drugs every year is not low. It's not super high, but it is people that are competitive on the international scene too. So I always see that as like a thing that pops up in like Reddit, like ask Reddit questions like, what would you change about the Olympics? It's like, have people be on every drug under the sun and then have just normal people. It's like, well, that's what it is.
That's what's happening.
That literally is what you're watching.
Yes. I guess people are looking for that glaring asterisk on Barry Bonds' home run record, right? Like people are looking for a 158 marathon with an asterisk, and then a 159 clean. Maybe that's where like people are interested in that regard, but I'm not sure anyone's thought about like the brass tacks of how that would come to life.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah.
The thing I get reminded of is Icarus. You guys have seen that? Is the guy who's the filmmaker takes drugs, fully regimented cycle, and still does not win his big goal race and actually gets like demolished by a bunch of other people still. So taking the drugs isn't necessarily the thing that moves the needle.
Yeah.
You move the needle, but you don't move the needle.
He had a mechanical, but
exactly. And it turned out to be much more interesting.
That's
after too. I think that side of things too, as like the element behind doping control and drug testing is also if an athlete tests positive at the end of a season, how much prize money have they like taken from people? How many people have they actually like displaced from being able to recoup part of the business? Like somebody could be off the podium in a race that could have changed the trajectory of their career. And I feel like that is an analysis that doesn't necessarily get looked at. And it's just like, they test positive, they're banned for a couple of years, or they get results invalidated and stuff. But you always see, I feel like on Twitter, like somebody retweet the USADA announcement that so-and-so tested positive. It's like, I can't wait for my prize money from, placing second at this road race where they like swept and like took a couple $1,000 and stuff. So those layers to it, I feel like are those like interesting sort of things that come as like repercussions from not having proper doping control and stuff too.
I think of people in Boulder who have that story, right? Like Edna with the Boston Marathon is, Frank, another example.
Yeah.
Where I think Tracksmith did an article on Frank of having this kind of like after the fact, hey, you did win.
Yeah.
And what does that feel like and what does that mean to you? And from a brand standpoint, who's paying attention to the secondary announcement that this person won? What happens in that sense? So
totally.
I agree.
Drew, your thoughts about anything all related?
Yeah, I think a theme that we're all touching on here, and we're coming from different angles, but I think we're all recognizing the dichotomy between, again, to say like the activity of running and the sport of running, right? There's this lapse between it. It's the fandom that you mentioned, right? Like we're on the same. I ran Berlin this year. I was on the same course as Kipchoge. I will be again when I run Boston this year. But it seems like the widespread fandom and the commercialization of that fandom doesn't match the participation in the sport. There's going to be 40,000 people on the course, and to think of that being like an engine for growth of the sport, I don't think we've really seen the dividends for the sport of running from the activity of running. So I think we're all kind of speaking from it in the same way. The thing I would change about the industry to speak to that is, from my biased opinion, a better system and platform for elevating like creator content in it. I think this is interesting to think about if we think about media in general, where there have been traditional team sports, ball sports that have been around and on a platform for a very long time. We can argue 6 ways to Sunday about like why they're at that space, right? We could talk about how football's went from a 1 night a week broadcast to like 6, right? And how Super Bowl ads cost millions of dollars. So that is like something to think about, right? That was in the golden age of television media, and it was a matter of getting on TV. I think with track and field, we've seen, or just running in general, we've seen individual content creators doing interesting things to also bring eyes, bring attention, bring visibility to the sport. We have people creating podcasts, people vlogging, people telling their own journey in the activity of running and interacting with people at the top end of the sport. And that's something that like I think we need more people doing it. I think we need more people. I think we need a more diverse audience of people producing that content as well, to connect the sport and the activity of running, but also like the distribution of that media. Anybody can create a podcast or a YouTube channel, and I love that. But what is next? How do we validate the content and then distribute it widely and compensate those people for what they're doing? If you want to think about a sport that's like really disrupting right now in the traditional media sense, like pickleball is absolutely puzzling, and I shouldn't have said that word on this podcast. Yeah, you can. All
right, we're back on to 4 episodes.
Yeah. Can we beep that out?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. My parents will probably listen to this. So pickleball is interesting, and like this is an aside, right? But pickleball went the route of getting on primetime television. And they were a fad or a hobby from most outside people looking in within the last year or even 6 months. This was a sport that started in 2021 to most people, at least in their perception. So they're going the traditional media route, and most likely with a lot of sponsorship dollars and a lot of backers and things of that nature. Track and field and running has never experienced that kind of like injection of capital. So it needs the content creators and the crews and clubs to make it something. And I think that's something I would change. The platform needs to be more developed, and the compensation needs to match the value that people provide to it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mic drop.
Mic drop.
That was a good happy too.
Yeah.
That's going to be a terrible bit that I'm going to stop after this first episode. Yeah.
It'll be a callback.
It'll be a good callback. I think that's a great place to leave it, because it should give an expectation to people that are still listening with us that we do have plans and structures to cover a bunch of different areas, but also people will have different exciting answers that challenge maybe what we think, because I had no idea what you two were going to say, even if this is the first time we're recording it.
That's the bit.
I think it is. That's yeah. But I think that a lot of people that we hopefully get the chance to talk to will have some very intriguing ideas, and that could even just be a show in its own way of like, what would you change? But I feel like this is a great wrap up introduction for the first podcast that we're doing for Running the Show.
Yeah, I think this is great.
Thanks for tuning in to Running the Show. You can follow us on Instagram at running.theshow, or you can subscribe to us at anywhere you get your podcast. Be sure to tune in again soon for our next episode.